Driving you a fool. They know I'm the topic.
Yeah, 2500.
They heard I'm the topic. I keep them talking, my ears are open. I can hear what they saying. I'm feeling like Martin. I keep it stepping. I'm kicking knowledge like I'm putting out pans. Just X around it. You can tell how I'm rocking. You'll get the message. I ain't sending out spam. The streets is talking and they know that I'm popping. I'm feeling like I got the word in my hand. They heard I'm the topic. I keep them talking, my ears are open. I can hear what they saying. I'm feeling like Martin. I keep it stepping. I'm kicking knowledge like I'm putting out pans. Just X
Hey folks, Doc here. Welcome to this week's episode of Truth and Heart with Doc. Hopefully, you all are doing your best to stay as clear and as mindful as you can be in the midst of what's happening right now around the world, but in particular in our United States with the coronavirus and everything being so impacted by this outbreak. So I hope and pray that you do your best to stay as calm as you can be and to not let fear lead your decisions. All right, because I know it's a lot happening. So, all right, let's get started with our first segment today. Doc's got something to say. Now, there is this video that went viral about a week and a half ago. The hairstylist name, I believe, is Lil Wave Baby, or at least that's what her Instagram name is. And I came across it. And there is this video segment that she posted of her braiding this little girl's hair named Ariana. And Ariana, so they were sitting there. It looks like Ariana could have been in her house or somewhere like that. It didn't look like a hair salon, but they were sitting. Ariana was sitting, and Lil Wave Baby, that's what I'm going to call her because that's her Instagram name. So that's how I'm going to refer to her. Lil Wave Baby was braiding her hair, and it looked like Ariana had caught a glimpse of herself in a mirror that was to the side of her. And so, she just breaks out and says, I'm ugly when she looks at herself. And she says, I'm so ugly. And so the hairstylist, you can see, was so taken aback by this. Here we have a 4-year-old little one saying something about herself, to herself, her reflection, right? And so the hairstylist is just so caught off guard, and you can see she's upset by that. And so she proceeds, to try and redirect Ariana, correcting her on that perception of herself, telling her, not to say things like that to herself. And if you watch the snippet, the segment, and I'm going to include the link to the video and this week's discussion. I'll include it so you guys can go back and watch it as well. So if you watch the interaction, you see the hairstylist really try to encourage Ariana, try to uplift her, tell her, correct her on that negative, destructive way of talking to herself, of thinking about herself. She tries to compliment her on her physical features, and then she moves into what's on the inside of Ariana, how she's sweet, how she's smart, and so how she tries to speak life into her, by asking her what does she want to do when she grows up. The hairstylist encourages Ariana that she can be whatever she wants to be when she grows up. She tries to give her feedback. Little Ariana says that she wants to be a teacher when she grows up. So the hairstylist encourages her on the kind of teacher that she could be. But something stood out to me about that interaction that I really kind of want to use as a springboard for our discussion today. And that is, as the hairstylist was giving Ariana her feedback, you see Ariana just sit there and take it in. She doesn't smile. She doesn't even frown. She just sits there with this look on her face. And it's almost like she has to process it again, because so far everything that she's been told about herself and flies in the face of, or everything that she's told herself about herself, what the hairstylist is saying is contradicting that. And you can kind of see the wheels turning in little Ariana's brain, so to speak, in her mind, like she's sitting there taking it in, almost like she's not totally convinced, but she's trying to process it. And so I wonder, that reminds me of many of us as adults, the colorism, those things that we've encountered, those things that we've been told about ourselves, taught about ourselves, those things that we've told ourselves about ourselves, right? And so I wonder how many of us still have that 4-year old little Ariana on the inside of us, the point at which, some of those early messages, some of those negative things that we've been taught about ourselves, that we think about ourselves, that all has an origin. And so let's talk about that, because this concept of colorism, of preferential treatment based on skin tone, based on complexion, this concept of physical features, nose, bone structure, lips, hair texture, that still continues to plague us in 2020. And by the way, let me be clear, other racial and ethnic groups, not just Black folk, not just folks of African descent, other racial and ethnic groups deal with this concept as well. This struggle with colorism. And so I used to live in Southern California. I moved out there about 20 years ago. And so I remember some of my closest friends, one of my closest friends, she is, I think, first generation Mexican American. And she and I would share with her some of my struggles, with Baltimore, born and bred, and then moving from Baltimore out to Southern California. The culture, it was a bit of a culture shock for me. And so she would share with me how, for her as a Latina woman, that they deal with the same kinds of issues and struggles as well, in terms of comparing oneself to this Anglo standard, this European standard, in terms of lightness, in terms of physical features, eye color. That's a big one, folks. Eye color, hair texture. And so this isn't something specific or unique to one racial or ethnic group. I think that, again, many different folks, many different communities struggle with these concepts. I remember she was telling me that, in their culture, when women dye their hair blonde, that's seen as a luxury, or that can be seen as a sign of affluence or having economic resources, that you can dye your hair blonde and potentially, assimilate or model yourself more after Anglo standards, right? And so let's talk about that, because I get it. For this little girl, especially for folk of African descent, for American Blacks, that standard for us has been to judge ourselves, as we've been judged, based on to what degree do we assimilate or fit into that Anglo standard, right? All origins of slavery. There was this division there between, the field Negroes and the house Negroes, all based on skin color, all of that. So I didn't really, that's just the foundation. And I get how those messages, we still get a lot of those messages being fed to us from the outside. But what I'd like to talk about is, at what point and to what degree, now in 2020, y'all, with all of this social media, with all of these advancements, with all of this access to information, and all of this quote unquote knowledge that we have, to what degree are we still going to allow ourselves to buy into these things, right? And so, yes, again, I get it. A lot of this messaging, we're fed that through advertisement, through almost everything that we watch, that our eyes and ears take in. I understand that. But I think we as individuals have a responsibility now to really, to what degree do we still blame the external, right? Now, I think we need to focus on, okay, we know that. Now, what are we going to do to shift these things? What are we going to do within ourselves to shift this, to make sure we don't continue to pass this on to our children, right? Because little Ariana, even if her mother or her parents, her caregivers, even if they don't speak that into her, the baby goes to school. And so, what are the other children saying to her? Potentially, how is the teacher responding to her? Maybe not so much through verbal messages, through what's said, but through nonverbal actions and behaviors, right? How are the other children interacting with Ariana, right? And so, or our kids. And so, let's talk about that. Chime in to the discussion section below, but y'all, we got to turn this around. We have a 4-year-old child who already is looking at herself, who already has an issue with her reflection, with what she sees looking back at her. What are we going to do about this? All right. And so, how do we begin to shift and to excuse me, and reprogram our thoughts, our thinking around these concepts, around, these issues, these things that unfortunately now we're bogging ourselves down with, right? We continue, it's been instilled in us, and now some 150, 180 years, no, what are we, 150, 160 years, not quite, post emancipation, some 500, 600 years since our being brought into this country in shackles, we are still doing this to ourselves. And again, that time frame, it didn't get this way overnight. It took centuries of that kind of programming, of that, and of that kind of treatment for us to get to the situation we're in now. So I know that it's not going to turn around overnight, but it's got to start in small increments and small steps. What do you say to your children? How do you prepare them? How do you rear them to love all of who they see looking back at them when they go out into a world that will sometimes judge them literally based on not just the color of their skin, right? But also their features, how they talk, how they present themselves. I remember when I was in school, I come from a very working class family in Baltimore. And I remember once I got to a certain point in college, and especially in graduate school, it was not so much about what I was saying, it was how I was saying things. So here I was, right? I got to be honest with y'all. I was being judged by these professional folks, these psychologists, these sociologists, these supervisors, these directors, all of these folks in these spaces that I wanted to really enter into as a marriage and family therapist, as a psychologist in training. I was being judged on to what degree did I sound like them. So my Baltimore accent, I had to really kind of work on. And that's just with how I talk. So we're not even going to get into the physical features, y'all. We got to work on this. How do we pour into ourselves and equip our children so that their sense of self, and so that their self esteem won't be totally shattered and diminished when they go out into the outside world that totally will try to underride and potentially do just the opposite of what we've tried to teach them. Check out the video. It's pretty heartbreaking, but I think little Ariana, I think it's more Arianas out here. And I can't tell you how many women I've encountered who tend to be of darker skin, fuller feature. They relate to Ariana because that part of them still has trying to recover, trying to get better, trying to be better. All right, folks. So chime into the discussion section below. We're going to get ready to move on to our next segment, Mental Health Matters. And so join me this week in welcoming our special guest, um, Miss Kiana Hill. Say hello to everybody, Key.
Hi everybody, how are you guys?
Talk up some.
Hello
There you
all.
go. Okay. And you guys, Kiana is joining me today for our Mental Health Matters segment because I think it's important to talk about this topic. We're going to talk about being a parent of a child who is diagnosed with special needs. Because I think that there are a lot of folks, a lot of children out there who have special needs. And now, what's happening, with a lot of the shifts and changes in education, children are being more mainstreamed and more included, which means that, these separate classes, these separate educational settings, they're working on really including children more throughout not just the academic day, but more throughout the school, more throughout our society as a whole. And so that still doesn't mean that just because the policies are changing, people's individual attitudes and perceptions are changing. And so Kiana has a son, he's almost 16, who is um, diagnosed with several disabilities. And could you name some of the disabilities he's
His
diagnosed with?
diagnosis, um, his IEP is coded as multiple disabilities because he has four main diagnoses. PDD-NOS,
Which,
which is a form of autism. ADHD, which is common among many children. Mild mental impairment, which is the current term for retardation. They no longer use that term medically. And his last diagnosis is bipolar disorder.
so a number of things.
Yes.
And so in our country, right now, at this moment, 6.2% of children ages 5 through 15, or 2.8 million kids, have disabilities. And our Census Bureau estimates that 20% of Americans between the ages of 16 through 64 have some form of physical, mental, or emotional impairment. And when we think about special needs children, there are four major types of special needs. The first type is physical disability, and that would include diagnoses such as epilepsy, multiple multiple sclerosis, muscular dystrophy, and chronic asthma. The second major type of special needs are developmental, which would be Down syndrome, autism, dyslexia, processing disorder. The third type of special need for children is behavioral and emotional, and that will be attention deficit, bipolar disorder, and opposition. And then the fourth type of special need would be sensory impaired, and that will be our kids who have limited hearing, deaf, visually impaired, or blind. So those are the four major types of special needs categories that many of our children fall within. And so for Kiana's son, he's in two of those categories, with the autism and the intellectual delay. as well as with the attention deficit,
Yes.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so,
And he has asthma.
and he has asthma, so
He
three.
does have asthma.
Right. And so, folks, let's talk about this. What that is like in 2020 again, with all of this push for inclusion, for acceptance with certain things, or acceptance and inclusion to a point as long as you keep it over there. Maybe.
But I also think that's where you border on the difference between acceptance and tolerance.
Okay, let's talk about that in your experiences.
Um, because you can tolerate someone in your space, at your job, in your school, but that doesn't necessarily mean you accept them, who they are or what they bring to the table.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that it's a very thin line between the two, but they are two different things, and I think that sometimes they get meshed together.
Do you think a lot of folks sometimes mesh them or overlook
Yes.
the inclusion?
Yes.
So,
I do.
so tell me, what have been some of your major struggles or difficulties parenting a child who's diagnosed with special needs as it relates to the difference between the two, tolerance and inclusion?
Um, struggle. Mhm. When I first found out I was having a boy, I was like, oh, I'm going to be a soccer mom. He's going to play basketball. He's going to play baseball. He's going to do this. He's going to do that. When you have mental disabilities and you have things that you don't receive information like other people, I can't just put you on a standard baseball team. I can't
Right,
just put you on a standard basketball team.
right.
So that was an idea and a dream that I had to let go. While there is Special Olympics, um, when he was diagnosed almost 11 years ago, that was not on the forefront. It wasn't as commonplace as it is now. So that was one thing that I kind of put on the back burner, or as you can say, a dream deferred.
Did you have to grieve that?
Yes, yes.
Because I also have a practice and I work a lot with children and families who are diagnosed with special needs. And folks, one of the major things that I tend to work with parents is working on, letting go of that idea of the child that they thought they were going to have and learning how to come to terms with the reality of the child who they have before them. What was the process like for you?
It's still ongoing.
Right.
I mean, children have different stages in life.
Mhm.
So when he was, I've shared with you, when he was
Right.
first diagnosed, I was told to make him a ward of the state.
Which is amazing to me because her son is not even 18 yet. So this is not,
He's 5.
yeah, this is not 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. Because I've also worked with adults with developmental disabilities. This is not then. This is crazy. 10 years ago to me, I was like, who would say that?
Yeah.
In 2008, 2009.
At one of the best hospitals in Baltimore,
Phew.
one of the top developmental pediatricians advised me to make him a ward of the state so that he could get appropriate services.
Wow.
And my comment to him was, "This is my child. He belongs with me, not with the state." So to answer your question, every stage of his life, I have to overcome something. I have to let go of an idea that I've had for him. Currently, on his IEP, I have him set for diploma track because I want my son to have the possibility of attending college. Administration constantly pushes me to turn him to certificate track because it will be easier. They don't want him to face standardized testing. They don't think it would be something that he'd be successful at. And my comment to them every year, because we meet every September for his IEP meeting, my comment to them every year is, I do not close the door to my son until I know there's a window for us to get out of.
So I like how you just said you don't want to close a door without knowing that there's a window that you two can go through.
Yes.
And so, what are some of your thoughts as it relates to how other parents who have children who are diagnosed with these special needs can manage and navigate and help their children excel. Because I think too often, I think sometimes there's a threshold or there's capacity and potential. And I think that every child should be given the opportunity to realize or to reach, to identify whatever their capacity and potential is without people necessarily assuming
Right.
what that capacity and potential should be.
Right.
So, what are some of your thoughts or feedback for how other parents can help to advocate for their children in that way?
Well, I think you just answered it. Like each child has to excel at what they're good at
Right,
and at their own pace.
right,
So I think one of the biggest things that parents can do is lose that concept
right.
of, oh, well, you have to reach this bar to be successful.
Mm,
Because for me, my son learning how to tie his shoes was a success. My son learning how to multiply was a success.
yeah,
So you have to lose, I hate the word normal, you have to lose those typical
typical,
standards.
right? Because we refer to those as more kind of like typical
Right,
typical brain development, and
right,
children who are outside of that
right,
are neurotypical. That's like an industry word, but I
right.
that word normal,
I
y'all.
hate that word.
That's what does that mean?
Because your normal is going to be different from my
Right,
normal. Everybody has their own normal. So to say normal all the time
and
means nothing.
that's so judgmental
Yes,
because that's assuming that my perspective
it's not.
is the correct one, and if
Right.
you're outside of that, you're
You're
somehow
wrong.
flawed, right, and damaged, right, or
Yes,
wrong. So typical for those
yes,
kids who are outside of that typical pattern of
yes.
development, how do we help other parents, first of all, learn how to better see their children in that way? Because I think part of it is you can't really advocate for your child in that way if
Right,
you're still struggling
right.
to come to terms with things. So, what does that process look like for our parents? For how they learn how to see their children for who they are in front of them versus what they would like them to be, number one. And number two,
Okay.
how they advocate for their children with work, with school, with their families,
Right.
because that's a big one too.
Oh, yes. That's first would be follow your children. Listen to them. Just because they may not process like you and I,
Mm,
just because their thought process may be a little different, they may learn a little differently. They still have thoughts. They
right,
still have ideas. They still have dreams.
right.
And you have to foster the things that they're good at.
Mhm,
My son is a techie. He's
mhm.
like, oh, don't let them play video games. He can do things on that PS4 that I can't
Right.
even explain. He once had a computer that I thought was broken. I couldn't turn on. He sat at it for like a
Mm,
half an hour and he got it to turn on. I still don't know what he did to it.
right,
So I foster what he's good at
right,
and I take his lead. What do you like? What do you not like? I'm not going to force him to do something. Do I make him try new things? Yes. But if he says, I don't like this, I'm not going to continue to push it.
right,
So, but I think that that's what people should do with any child,
right,
typical or non typical.
right,
So you have to take that lead. And as parents, we have to let go of what our dreams may necessarily want because our children are their own people.
what a novel concept, y'all. Children are people, and they're not literally just here to reflect us.
No.
They have their own sense of selves,
Mm-hmm.
even when they come out as
Yes.
little ones. So, right, I'm being sarcastic, you guys, but you get what I'm saying. That's a huge one too, because
Yes.
that's hard sometimes
It's
to
hard.
separate our children from ourselves or ourselves from our children.
Right.
And I think within that, though, part of I think that difficulty is whenever I have to work with parents, especially moms, they
Yes.
tend to blame themselves.
Oh, yes.
They tend to personalize or to say it's something I did or didn't do for the
But,
reason why my child is like this.
but we carry that child. We
Yes,
carry that child. We grow that child.
right.
So we feel fully responsible for that child. My son is almost 16 and I still feel responsible for everything he does. Like if I get a call from the school, I freeze. When I see the school's number on the call ID, like what's going on? What did he do? Oh, because he's my child, he's my responsibility. So I think as mothers, we tend to hold on to that as we're raising our children because we grew this person. We made this person.
But can I tell you guys something professionally? Yes, some of these things may be genetic. Yes, but a lot of them are not.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna put that out there. So, right,
And some of it can come from dad's side.
right. Some of it can come from dad's side. So
It can come from
again,
dad's side.
truth and heart, you guys. That's what this is about, right? Being able to take in that information, but then it's about here, right? Learning how to let your heart be open to that. So I'm saying that to say, folks, moms in particular, it is what it is, but some of this is outside of your control. Was outside of your control.
Well, I'm a spiritual person, and I believe that there's a higher being, and he does not make mistakes.
Mm. Mm.
My son is my son for a reason, and I'm his mother for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
And whatever that reason may be,
Mm.
I always say I do the best I can with what I have,
Mm-hmm.
and I make it work.
So how do you? Because we got to get ready to wrap this up.
Yes, ma'am.
But how do you, with those things in mind, right?
Mhm.
How then do you move from the inside of you and your child's world, and then move that outward, and help your child and you
Mhm.
deal with the schools, deal with the workplaces, deal with families, your family members who may not be as tolerant or open to inclusion.
Right. Um, since my son was diagnosed, I've had conversations with him periodically about who he is, what his
Mm.
labels are,
Mm.
and what the outside world may think of him. I've had straight up conversations, no cut cards. People out there are going to think you're stupid
Mm.
because you carry this label. People are going to think that you're insane
Mm.
because you carry this label. You know you're not, and I know you're not. That's all that matters. When it comes to school, it took me 2 years to get him in a non public setting. I had IEP meetings almost every month. Okay, this is not a good fit. If you're sending him home 3 out of 5 days a week, you're not doing what you're supposed to. What's the next level?
Mm.
I don't have time to be trying to figure out these little things. What does he need? Can you supply it?
Right.
With family, honestly, I do have some family that have treated him like he's contagious.
Mm.
I just don't take him around them.
Right.
I have
Right.
an amazing support system. Anybody that knows me knows my friends
Yeah.
are my family.
Yeah.
Those are his aunts and uncles and cousins, and they ride hard
Yeah.
for him.
Yeah.
It's harder than me sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, we do. I gotta get on her sometimes because sometimes I'm like, can you just ease up off of him
No,
just a little bit?
no.
So this is, well, we're not gonna do this in front of them. But so chime in, folks. Of, it's a lot to process. It's a lot to digest.
Yes.
Um,
And if you have any questions for me, I follow her and I read the comments.
right,
So I'll
right,
be commenting and looking. So
right. So this is one mom's, one parent's perspective on how she manages being a mother of a child who is diagnosed with these special needs. I don't want to say a child who is special needs because he is more, your child is more than their diagnoses. The diagnoses are just a part of who they are, not the totality of who they are. So I'm being very purposeful and intentional with that, okay? Because I honestly believe that. And I think that's a huge part of
yeah.
how this shift has to happen. All right, folks, chime in below. That's it for this week's episode of Truth and Heart with Doc. Let your mind be clear to recognize the truth and your heart open to receive it. See you next week. Bye bye.